also a lot of the things that we did in school did not really translate to the real world. I'm like, this whole notion that kids have to wait until they're 18 to contribute to society is mind-boggling for me. Because like, what? Like, we just expect them that after 18 years of being confined in this like make-believe places, like schools where, there's like learning going on. And then we put them in the real world and it's like, you're expected to know what to do. How are they going to know what to do if they really have a chance to do anything until they become 18? And so I feel like we should involve them from the beginning and have, sort of like, forget about this myth that learning happens in school. Learning happens everywhere.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast. Today, I am joined by the amazing Lorena Fabrega. Lorena Fabrega, known by her students as Mrs. Fab, invites us to rethink education. And she is the author of the upcoming book, The Learning Game, which I have here right now, September 5th, 2023. And the book is about teaching kids to think for themselves, embrace challenges, and love learning, which you can pre-order now or order now using the link in the episode's show notes. So, Anna, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Alex. I'm very excited to chat.
I'm very excited to have you here. And as I mentioned before we started recording, your book is such a great book. It's an insight into the education system, what went wrong, what could go right, and how can we make it right for our kids and hopefully my kids who have not been born yet. So hopefully I get to read this to them and also read it as I make it happen. I have kids. Mm-hmm. So Anna, let's start with your trajectory. You attended 10 different schools in 7 different countries. That's insane. And at least for me, if I get to visit 7 different countries as a tourist, I feel like my whole perspective changes and I'm a renewed person. So I can't imagine what did this to you. So how did your trajectory growing up in not 1, not 3, but 7 different countries and 10 different schools, including Mexico City, impact your way of thinking and engaging with the world? And how many languages do you speak?
Yeah. So, when it comes to school, I always say that I've been around the block a few times. So I was born in Panama, but due to my dad's job, we had to move around a lot. So by the time I was 14, I had lived in Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, India, Mexico, Brazil, and the US. And so it was like change was my constant, right? Every 2 years, sort of everything had an expiration date. And I kind of knew that. I picked up that quickly. And I didn't really realize how that was affecting me positively and negatively at the time. Obviously, this is something that I've reflected a lot now that I'm older and now that I do what I do. But as a kid, I think that moving around a lot, of course, it impacted a lot of things in my life. But one of the big things is that I was excited about everything. And sort of my personality is very bubbly and I love to learn and I love to talk about the things that I'm learning about. I love to ask questions. I'm very curious. And like, I feel like all these traits of my personality come from moving around so much and experiencing life and cultures and different languages so often. I also got to be, like you mentioned, a student in 10 different schools. I was always the new girl. I always had to start over and need to figure out how to make friends. Sometimes I didn't speak the language. I was very lucky that a lot of these countries spoke Spanish. So that was my first language. Brazil, Portuguese, I picked it up pretty quickly. I was in that age where I made a lot of Brazilian friends, and the younger you are, the quicker you are to pick up on languages. So I quickly picked up on Portuguese. When I moved to India, though, I did not speak English yet. And so I was in an American school, and I always asked my mom, I'm like, I was 8 years old. I did not speak English. How did I make friends? Because I see videos of me talking and doing this and with all my friends. And I was like, and my mom was like, I don't know. You figured it out. Like, you literally did not speak English, but you had friends. You did not really complain.
Wow.
And I think that a big thing that she did very smartly, my mom, was that she found one thing that we could do in every country, no matter what, and that was dance. So since I was 2 years old, I did ballet, tap, jazz, modern dance competitively, and that was sort of like a big thing in my life. And it was great because I didn't need to speak the language in order to do this, right? I just showed up in a country, I would get enrolled in a new dance school, and I could do that after school. And so that was a big, big part of my life that taught me many, many different things. And so I think that moving around a lot really opened my eyes to the fact that, everyone has different opinions and different ideas and different ways of viewing things. And it made me quickly realize that my way was not the right way. And that I had to be careful with the way that I put my thoughts out. Especially when I was like trying to make friends in different countries, like I had to be, mindful of the cultural differences, mindful of the things that were already established. And so that really impacted a lot of the way that I am today. It helped me become really flexible, which was probably one of my best traits as a teacher. I quickly adapt to change. I embrace change. I actually crave change. Every 2 years, I'm always like, okay, what's next? Where are we going now? I've been for 3 years in Miami now, and I'm like talking to my husband. I'm like, well, where are we going next? Like, I'm always excited for the next thing. And so, yeah, those were some of the positive things. And then there's a lot that I experienced in all these schools that actually was sort of like a springboard to what I did today in education. And we can get to that in a bit.
Yeah. Wow. That's quite a trajectory. And you touch on so many traits that you have: energy, passion, curiosity, adaptation, dancing, diversity of thought, which is essential to what you discuss in the learning game and what it needs to happen in our education system. And all of these ideas and also these traits embodying in you, that's really remarkable. And I want to get into those as we go along. But the learning game is dedicated to your son, Fair. That was amazing. And you say to him, stay curious. You also touch that you're a very curious person. And I'm curious to know, why do you believe curiosity is the building block of our kids' education? And how are we failing to see this in our current system?
Yeah, so I think that one of the big flaws with the education system is that it sort of teaches you what to think, right? It tells you, it tries to impart that these are sort of the things that are true, and everyone learns the same thing. And if everyone agrees on something, then it must be true, even if it's not true, or if the idea is not even new. And so I'm actually very interested on coming up with novel ideas, not necessarily what's considered true, but actually what's considered new and surprising. And in order to get there, you need to sort of look at things from different angles. You need to be excited about learning about new things. You need to be very curious. And so I think that curiosity is sort of what's led me to do all the things that I've been able to do, and led me to closer to my passion and sort of what I want to dedicate my life to. And so it's something that it's such a valuable trait that everyone's born with. If you look at a little kid, they're curious about everything. That's sort of the precursor to learning, right? They want to know about something and they won't stop until they finally find the answer or figure it out or play with it and break it. And so it all comes from curiosity. And I think that, being a lifelong learner is the best skill that anyone can develop. And it comes from cultivating this attitude of curiosity. And so a lot of times schools squelch that. And this is a big concern, right? Because everyone, like I said, you're born curious, but then you enter the system where suddenly you're not allowed to ask a lot of questions, right? Kids are always like, well, why this? And what about this? And how come this? And it gets to a point where they stop asking these questions. And the reason for that is because parents, teachers, and, older people start to be like, stop asking questions, or because sometimes we don't know the answer and we get so insecure because we've been trained that we need to have all the answers, when in reality, that's not the case. We're not comfortable saying, you know what, I don't know, let's figure it out. Or, I'm not the expert, but you can help me figure this out. We're not used to do this. And this is actually such a great trait to develop. And so because of this insecurities, we squelch these questions, or because we're overwhelmed and parents come home and, they're like, stop asking questions. Like, I don't have time for this. That's one of the most harmful things we can do with kids, because we are, again, tampering and putting down this curiosity. And so the number one thing that I wish for my kid, and I wish for myself, is to be infinitely patient so that I can continue cultivating his curiosity for life. There's nothing that I enjoy more than watching him explore everything around him and, fall and break things and, get frustrated because he can't figure something out. And I just feel like that's wonderful because that's his curiosity kind of unfolding. And so I wish that for every kid. And my priority as a parent is to cultivate that.
Wow. Yeah. And, reading the learning game and right now listening to you, I remember when, I took a break after reading it for a few chapters, and I went for a walk. I saw a rainbow, right? And then the eureka moment hit when I said, this is a rainbow. Wow, I'm in awe with the world. I'm in awe with life. And I connected your ideas, like we forget that. Sometimes we just go automatically to say, another rainbow. It's another metric in our world. It's just another thing. Or then a typhoon happened in the sea and everyone was recording it. No one was really curious, no one was really thinking deep that there's a typhoon. If they would see this in an interstellar movie, they would be like mind blown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, the principle that I get from the learning game is that you're trying to cultivate not only with our kids, but also with us, awe of life, inspiration, curiosity, and that insatiable need to understand and to ask questions like, when did we get it wrong? To say I don't know. It's just an opening to learn more about, we have 100 years here. I want to sink everything that I know, and that's why I love the learning game. So I appreciate that.
I love that you got that insight. That's exactly right. And it's kind of reviving that inner child that we all have through, all these questions and things that we've forgotten when you kind of like unlearn a lot of the things that we've learned in order to get back to that. So I'm very glad that you got that.
Yeah. And like you say, it's paradoxical because our education system, the goal in itself is to raise, good people, good adults, leaders. And the paradox here is that we just become numb across life. We just become metrics and quantifying life and just, another checking boxes, like you say. We're always trying to ace the test. We're always trying to make our definition of life successful in the things we do, not on who we are as a person. So that was one of the things that you mentioned as a teacher that left you frustrated of the education system, that it didn't work for you or your students. And I would like to get to some of the themes that revolve around your time as a teacher that made you feel this way. How did you ultimately break free from this system?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I wanted to become a teacher was because like I said, I love to learn from different people. And the more I spent time with kids before I became a teacher, I realized that they're like learning machines. And we often talk about what we're teaching them, but really it's all that we're learning from them, right? And so I was very excited to be surrounded every day with the different kids, different personalities. They're excited about everything. They're still not, numb, like you mentioned, and they're just curious about everything. And so I was just very excited and excited to sort of shape them and help them, shape this new generation that's going to be really driving civilization forward. And so that to me was a mindful way of spending my time. The problem was that when I actually became a teacher, and it actually was a little bit before that, but let's just go into when I was already a teacher, I started to realize that kids spend so much time in a classroom with us every day, and it's their most precious years, right? It's their childhood years. And I just didn't think that we were spending that time correctly and or to the best way that we could. I look at kids and I see what makes them unique and what makes them, excited and what they're really good at. And it's like sort of the opposite of what we're training them to do in school with all the structure and the parameters and the lesson plans. And I feel like learning is a lot more open and a lot more natural and not as structured as we make it in the school system. And so when I started to see that this excitement that they have in their eyes for learning was starting to fade as we impose all these lessons, as certain learning becomes forced, and when we remove all the choices and the autonomy that they have. And, it's like we're removing something that they're already so good at. Like, and instead of making it better, we were making it worse. And even though I was very aware of this, because I had to follow all these parameters and focus on the tests and like all these bureaucracies, I couldn't really do the things that I felt deep inside that would help them become happy, successful individuals once they left school. And so I was very frustrated for years because I could feel this, but I didn't really know what to do. And then ultimately I realized, I think I'm better off leaving the classroom in search for learning opportunities that kids actually want to be part of, learning opportunities that are driven by the children and that actually prepare them with the skills that we know that they will need in the future. And I'm not talking about content because content is constantly changing. And as long as we teach them how to learn, they can pick that up on their own, right? Yeah. I'm talking about like those soft skills that I do see the importance of having an adult helping them and guiding them in this process. And those are the things that I didn't feel like we were teaching in school. For example, how to, instead of, in school, we teach them to we remove points every time they make a mistake. And that teaches them not to want to make mistakes, right? Because they get penalized with that bad grade that then goes on their report card, high stakes that haunts them for the rest of their lives. Of course, what's the lesson we're teaching them? Fear making mistakes. When in reality, mistakes are part of the learning process. It's how you learn to pick yourself up and, keep going and get to that insight that's on the other side. It should be feedback that helps you realize the things that you haven't mastered yet, because you're a kid. You're not expected to know everything. This is a time where you're, learning a lot of these skills. And so really befriending mistakes and befriending failure was not something we were doing in school, and something that I'm like, this is very important. And so, or this whole notion that, we're sort of the fountain of wisdom and imparting all this knowledge, and from lesson plans that oftentimes I was like, they lack so much context and relevance, and I don't know when they're going to use this. And kids feel this. They, we're asking them to learn all this stuff, and they're like, well, why? When am I going to use this? And I had no answers. And that was very frustrating, because I'm like, I'm wasting their time and I'm wasting my time. And so I didn't really find, and this is just, I'm scratching the surface, right? Also, a lot of the things that we did in school did not really translate to the real world. I'm like, this whole notion that kids have to wait until they're 18 to contribute to society is mind-boggling for me. Because like, what? Like, we just expect them that after 18 years of being confined in this like make-believe places, like schools where, there's like learning going on. And then we put them in the real world, and it's like, you're expected to know what to do. How are they going to know what to do if they really have a chance to do anything until they become 18? And so I feel like we should involve them from the beginning and have, sort of like, forget about this myth that learning happens in school. Learning happens everywhere. We're surrounded by it. It happens in the real world. So how can we create learning experiences that resemble the real world? How can we give kids real problems to solve that they are actually invested in, that they want to? And then they're going to need different things in order to solve these problems. And that's when you start to introduce them to the different tools and the different subjects that are going to help them solve these problems. They start to see the connection between what we're asking them to learn and how they're going to use it. That's where the curiosity starts to spark, because they're like, wait, I need this in order to solve this. And so it becomes a more natural way, an effective way of teaching and learning. And so I ended up leaving in 2019 without really an idea of what I was going to do next, but I wanted to explore a lot of these questions that I had, a lot of these things that I was seeing in the school system, and try to see what was out there. And so fast forward a few years, and I don't know if you want to get into this now, but I'm kind of working in the alternative education space, and I'm in this really innovative ed tech company that's we're trying many different things, starting from this idea that, how do kids learn? What are the skills that they're going to need in the future that they're not learning in school? How can we use their time productively? How can we get them excited to learn? How can we empower them so that they own their learning experiences and make it really challenging? Because of course we need to challenge them, right? But at the same time, making engaging and fun. And so that's sort of what we're doing now. And we have a long way to go, but I really enjoy seeing kids in this environment where suddenly they're in charge of their learning.
Wow. Yeah, we will definitely touch on synthesis and how you're connecting with DARPA techniques, which is just, when you listen to DARPA, something serious is cooking there. Mm-hmm. And I remember that when you just mentioned, when will I use this? Your kids telling you, when will I use this? And I remember when I read that in the learning game, and I listen to you right now, every time I would tell that to my teachers, they would never answer. They were like, this is just what we do. Mm-hmm. And they themselves, this is what they did. So it's just a revolving cycle of conditioning. We don't have the answers. We just do it for inertia. And because this has been, like you write in the learning game, this education system has been in the making since Prussia existed. Mm-hmm. When did Prussia exist? Did Prussia know that we're going to be leveraging AI for education in 2023? Absolutely not. So how are we still extrapolating that? But Anna, you touch on, this overarching theme, which is the game of school, and you touch it deeper in the learning game, but I want to spoil it a bit more for our listeners because I feel it's a very, very important theme. And this was one of the reasons that you said you were successful in adapting to new environments when you were growing, was because you knew how to play the game of school. It's a game. And what is this game you talk about, and why is it so dangerous to actually win within it?
Yeah. So I talked about earlier my experience outside of school, right? But I didn't really talk about what I was learning in this 10 different schools that I went to. So the reason why I was able to pass, and I was, I wasn't the best student, but I was also not the worst student. I just passed by, right? I quickly learned the things that I needed to do in order not to get in trouble, when to raise my hand to get that participation grade, how to quickly do my homework and worksheets and all the, all the schoolwork so that I could get the school learning out of the way and actually do the things that I wanted to do, what I had to do not to get in trouble, how to pick up on the things that, the little strategies in order to pass those standardized tests, but I wasn't really learning much or I couldn't remember anything after the test. So this is what I call, the learning game. So it's not really learning, it's just sort of the shortcuts that kids get really good at, in order to appear as if they're learning and not get in trouble and pass through the motions until they graduate. And so you can see how this is a very dangerous thing, right? Because it's like you, again, spending all these years, all this time in school, and there's not really authentic, long-lasting learning going on. And then when I was actually going through my teacher training program at NYU, and I had to student teach for several hours in different schools and observe the students, that's when it dawned on me that most of the students that I was watching, and I don't think it's a coincidence, were also playing the game of school. They were not really engaged in the lessons. I didn't really think that the learning was sticking after they took the test. They were just all raising their hand. They were being quiet. They were sitting down. They knew when to talk, when not to talk, how to complete their homework, how to do, like they had picked up on the game of school. That's when I realized, whoa, this is not particular to me. Like this game is universal. We're in trouble. We are in big trouble because there's so much more to learning than what's happening in the school settings. And a lot of parents never stop to think about it and don't really realize this because kids are very smart and they're very good at, imitating learning and picking up on this game. And so they get home with good grades and, good comments from the teacher because they're not getting in trouble and this and that. And parents are like, oh, everything's fine. But if you actually stop and think about it and look beneath that and you try to see if your kids, like everything's not fine, right? They're just picking up on this like very universal game. And so in my book, I try to talk about, well, how can we help kids opt out of this game of school that doesn't really help you in the real world and opt into the game of learning, right? And that's what the learning game is about. Like, what are the things that we need to do in order to help kids actually fall in love with learning again and learn how to think for themselves and learn to embrace challenge and learn, how to adapt to constant change and how to show up to a new environment and figure things out for themselves and how to pursue the things that make them happy and that they're good at and doubling down on that. Like all that is the game of learning. And this is something that we're not actively teaching in school. And by the way, I'm not blaming teachers at all. Like I was a teacher and I know all the things that we're expected to do on a daily basis with little recognition, really bad pay. So it's like not about the teachers. Like the teachers have this whole agenda of things they have to cover. But that's what I mean, like the whole system from within, like from beneath, it's messed up. The incentives, the things, the structure, everything. And so it's really hard for any individual to try to change things from within the system. So even great teachers, are going to have a hard time. Like I try to do things differently in my classroom. And I think that to an extent I did. But then when my kids would graduate and move on to other grades and other teachers that were also good, they started, this spark for the things that, or this love for writing and reading and math and the things that they used to enjoy in my classroom, they suddenly stopped enjoying those things. And school became very monotonous and they started to play the game. And so again, this is not a few cases that I saw. This was the vast majority of the students. And so I'm very determined with everything that I do to I don't have the right answers. I just have a lot of questions. And I think that my questions make people stop and think and reflect on their own school experiences, on the things that, got them excited as kids, the things that they dreaded in school. And it makes you reflect and kind of stop and at least say, maybe it's time to rethink a little bit of this. Maybe it doesn't make as much sense as I think it does. Maybe there are alternatives. Maybe I should, emphasize less grades and things like that I'm like tormenting my kid at home that maybe are not as important. And so hopefully, that's a starting point. And that's sort of my hope with this book.
Absolutely. And that your book, The Learning Game, did that for me. It made me question again our conceptions of the education system. And I would like to get deeper into the education system. You touch on the incentives, you touch on the structure, and from the ground up, everything is a bit crumbled. And like you say, it's not the teachers' blame. They're just put into this game and they have to make the best out of the game. So let's touch into the metricalization of schools, through standardized tests. And, they were built to measure kids' learning and also schools to compete between them to boast their scores. We are the best school, your school sucks, kind of like zero-sum game. And what are these tests truly measuring, Anna, and what do they lack measurement of? And how should we rethink these testings overall? And moreover, how have these tests influenced the decline of the education system?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. And again, I don't think that I have a clear-cut answer, but I have spent a lot of time thinking about this, especially because I would see how much emphasis we would put on standardized tests in schools, the kind of environment that it would create, all the anxiety for teachers, parents, administrators, students, for everyone involved, the amount of time that we would spend focusing on this that would take away from time to do the things that I thought that were actually more important. And then only to see that after the tests, kids would often forget a lot of what, they were cramming for, or kids who actually were really good at a subject. And I knew because I spent so much time with them, they were just not, they weren't good performing a test for several reasons, right? They wouldn't get good grades. And then suddenly, even though they knew the material, and it was very frustrating because then these kids would get penalized with a bad grade and they would actually start believing that, they were not good at this, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or, at this point, tests run everything in schools, right? Kids get into gifted programs or get into remediation groups. That's how they get into college. That's how they pass to the next grade. Teachers' salaries are often, tied to all this like standardized tests. Schools compete against each other. There's like a lot, like this test sort of like become the center of our education system. And that's where I think we go really wrong. Then you had the other kids who would do really, really well on these tests because they had, again, figured out because there's a strategy to it, right? They had picked up on the strategy, but then when you actually asked them the content later, they had no idea about it. They couldn't really apply this knowledge to solve a problem or for anything productive. And I was like, well, what are we doing, right? Why are we putting kids and teachers and administrators and everyone through this like craziness if the results are clearly not good? And so, of course, I'm not saying that the answer is we need to get rid of tests completely and not assess kids at all. Like, no, of course, like assessments do serve as a baseline to assess some of kids' capability in some of the subjects, right? But it's not the only way to assess them. And right now, that's what we are using and giving so much priority. And we emphasize, guys, these are high stakes tests. That creates a lot of pressure. So again, I don't have an answer of how to solve this, but I do have some ideas of what could help. If you think about what's the best way to assess someone when you want to teach them something, it's in a way that provides them feedback and for them to see how they can improve on whatever it is that they got wrong, right? It has to be inviting. It has to be a positive tone, right? Otherwise, you reject that. You're like, I'm not good at this, and you don't want to try it again. It kind of defeats the purpose of the whole thing, right? Because the whole point of an assessment is to see what you don't know yet so that you can improve on it. So what if we lowered the stakes? Meaning, I'm not talking about like we still provide challenging content to the students. I think that's very important. But the actual assessments, we lower the stakes. We don't make them such a priority. We don't make them the thing that they need to nail in order to get into college and pass grades and this and that. And so, what if we did that? If we kind of said like, this is just part of the way that we assess you. And then what if we brought in the options? If you look at homeschoolers, for example, they submit a portfolio at the end of the year to the local school board with, projects and business plans and essays and songs and this and like, it's a broad way, like lots of ways that they can showcase what they're learning. I think that, it's very clear that everyone is different. We all learn different ways and we have different aptitudes, right? So it's very silly that we have only one way to assess everyone, because obviously not everyone's going to perform well in that one way. And that doesn't mean that they're not smart or capable. And so what if we really spent time thinking about how can we open all these options and provide different ways for kids to show you how they're learning? And so again, some people listen to this and they're like, this is so idealistic because of course in a structured environment like school, it's really hard to do that when you have 30 kids and when you have all this curriculum that you have to do and all this, things that you have to assess and all these subjects and you have to move on quickly and da-da-da. So I can see why it's become a struggle to kind of implement it in school, which is why we need to rethink so many things. Like this makes me think of who came up with this idea of like, oh, we need to teach 5 subjects every day. It's like, what? And ring bells every 45 minutes and make you switch from one content to the other. That's not how we learn, right? We need time to actually, for things to marinate. We need to see how things are interconnected. We need to see, how science fits with literacy and with math. And so for that, we need more downtime. We need more time to actually dive deep in a lot of these things. We need to have time to actually step back from it. Like you were telling me, like you stepped out from the book from a little while and then you came back to it. That makes you, have time for, your curiosity and your creativity to kick in. And we don't allow for this with the way that school is structured. And again, it's done that way for organizational purposes and for productivity purposes so that we can educate the mass. But again, if you look at the results, and they're not promising, then it's time to rethink the whole thing, right? And so that's, something else that comes to mind because we're assessing all these subjects, but what if we have less subjects or focused on like one at a time? And so anyway, and then I feel like kids would do better if they thought about learning, we know that the most authentic parts of learning come when kids are playing and creating things and not worrying about being judged, right? And so in school, assessments interfere with this authentic kind of learning, right? Because we're like, you're learning and you're going to take a test on Friday and you need to show me what you learned. Boom, automatically that becomes the goal, right? And so that's really a problem. What if we kind of like forget about that and just focus on the learning and the learning process and getting kids to the goals and then seeing how we're going to showcase that learning to parents or to the actual kids and find those feedback loops, right? And so again, it's very abstract and it's hard to sort of put into like a concrete answer and say like, this is what schools are going to do now, but it's worth unpacking and thinking about, right?
100%. And I definitely agree that our system right now, the educational system, and when I went to school, which wasn't that long ago, it's just built to compartmentalize what we learn. And like you say, it didn't allow me to get into the specifics and then go backwards and, have this generalist strategy like you touched and then the specifics and all of these themes. They were just a mechanical 18 years of my life. And the biggest eye-opening stat that you write on the learning game is that the average kid has to follow twice as many restrictions as an incarcerated felon. I don't know how that makes sense. I have no idea. Like you say, thinking about changing the system may be idealistic. Let's look at the reality. Why are kids treated even worse than incarcerated felons? What felony did they make? Like trying to learn, trying to use the arenero, the sandbox of school to, shoot their shot, explore their ideas. Like how did we get here? And how can we get back, Anna, to realizing that the school system, the arenero, is not built to put like this plastic bubble wrap around their kids, which we're trying to make them safe, but paradoxically it just makes them less safe. And the best way to make them safer is to make them grow with values such as courageousness, integrity, conscientiousness, all of these themes that you touch on. So to boil it down, how can we switch from these rules, they follow so many restrictions, to removing the bubble wraps and paradoxically make them a bit more safer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that I have too. I think that ironically, we want to, like, the original purpose of school was, to teach kids to become independent and to learn how to solve problems on their own and to think for themselves and, a lot of these things. But we have over-engineered lesson plans and curriculums and teacher involvement to a point where all that thinking and all that creativity and all that, critical thinking is really happening on the administrator side and the people that are doing the lesson plans and the people that are actually organizing and creating the curriculums. And it's gotten to the point where we've masticado, just really watered things down to a point where kids are not, they're just merely, going through the motions, following instructions and following scripts and solving textbook problems. And we've really paved the way in such a way that they think that there's just one way to succeed. And this is what everyone does. And it's become, we have a lot of conventionally minded people as a result, right? And a lot of people that don't know how to solve problems on their own because everything has been solved for them. They don't know how to be independent because they rarely get chances to do things for themselves in school. When making decisions is such an important, like knowing how to make sound decisions is such an important skill that we need to have. But if you think about it, how often do kids get a chance to make consequential decisions when they're young, right? And again, when the stakes are low. It's very rare, right? The decisions that they make are very wishy-washy and things that they do in school that don't really matter. But I'm talking about no, if you want kids to grow up into adults that know how to make sound decisions, you need to give them practice. And so by making all these decisions for them and, sort of conducting their learning and this and that, we can't then expect for them to know how to be self-directed learners. We can't expect for them to know how to be independent and make sound decisions and know what to do when failure comes their way, because it will come their way, or what to do when, they're faced with conflict and with challenges, when things don't go their way. A big thing in school is that everything's so structured and everything's so predictable that when suddenly something goes out of the way, kids freak out. They don't know what to do. They become very insecure. Why? Because we've conditioned them this way. I believe that we've really turned kids very fragile in school, right? And we want to turn them into and help them become anti-fragile adults. We really have to rethink how we are spending time with them, the kind of challenges that we're giving them, and how much we intervene when they face, adversity. And so a lot of this, I talk about in my book. I have a whole chapter about how to raise anti-fragile adults. And it's something that's very difficult and very hard because we don't want to see kids suffer. We don't want to see them, when they get confused and they get frustrated. But the faster we realize that these things are actually making them stronger and are going to make them happier adults, then the faster we're going to be able to open up and give them these opportunities. Right. And so I think that schools are not really doing that because, again, they're focused on all this other stuff that I don't think is very relevant. And so really, it's the parents' job to make sure that they're getting these experiences, if not in school, then outside of school.
100%. And you touch also on homeschooling, which I want to get, later on because it's a personal question of mine. I've never understood homeschooling, honestly, not in a bad way. I've never really learn anything about it. And you touch right now on anti-fragility, how to raise anti-fragile kids. Shout out to Nassim Taleb. He's, I'm sure you're also a fan because the way he writes. And there's another idea that he touches on, and you touch a bit more in the learning game, which is, subtraction is actually addition. Via negativa, how to grow by removing instead of adding more. And this is a big theme in the learning game, one that has made me reflect a lot on, my own conceptions about learning and about life itself and about my time on earth, really. And, the question that I have that I would love you, Anna, to expand on for our listeners is, what are some of the lessons we should unlearn so we can relearn to learn and engage with new ideas and explore our humanity as a whole?
Yeah, I love that question. So a lot of people ask me because even though my book is framed through the lens of kids, and I talk a lot about kids because that's sort of how I view the world, if you think about it, it's really applicable to anybody, right? Anyone that's interested in learning and unlearning the harmful lessons that they learned in school that are impeding you to learn the things that actually are relevant in the real world. And so a lot of the things that and the faster you realize this, the faster you're on your way to actually learning. That's why I'm so interested in catching kids when they're young. But things like, and I've talked a little bit about this, but for example, this idea of fitting in school, they teach you to fit in, right? They say oh, this is the model student. This is what you should do. These are the kinds of careers that you should aspire for. Here's the path for you to get to for those careers. Here are the people that are successful. And you think about it, that when we talk about successful people in the real world, we rarely talk about this, entrepreneurs that were the rebels that did things differently, that sort of broke from the pack, that were the quote unquote troublemakers. We don't talk about those, right? We focus on the ones that kind of followed that right path and this and that. And you know what? That path may be good for some people, but it doesn't mean that it's good for everyone. And school teaches you that there's this one way to be successful in life. And it turns out that I would argue that it's not really right. And even if it is, it's just for some kids, but there's so many other ways that you can make it. And so many other ways that are closer to what you love to do and what you're good at, and it doesn't have to look like everybody else. And I would actually argue that you would be better off unlearning to fit in and just actually trying to see how you stand out. What are those things that make you different, that make you unique, that make you, not like everybody else, and then double down on those, because that's when you get to those creative breakthroughs and when you really find the unique value that you can provide to the world. And again, this is not something that school teaches you. This school teaches you the opposite. So you have to unlearn to fit in and then relearn for yourself. No, you need to stand out. You need to see how you can break from the path and find what makes you extraordinary and how you can contribute to the world. And so that's one thing. The other idea is, in school, we ask kids to follow instructions and to wait for the teacher to tell you what to do and don't get ahead of yourself and this and that. It's like, wait, nobody in the real world wants to hire someone that needs to be told what to do all the time, that you need to give them instructions or else they don't know what to. No, now more than ever, we want people that are problem solvers, that can figure things out, that are proactive, that won't ask for, of course, asking for help is fine, but not all the time, that, they're willing to give things a try. They're probably going to fail in the process, but people that say like, oh, I understand that this is part of it and I know what to do when I fail. I just pick myself up, see what I did wrong, see what I can learn from that, keep going. And so this is very important regardless of what field you end up in. And again, schools are teaching you to do the opposite. So the faster you realize this, that this is another lesson that you need to unlearn, the faster you're on your way to learning what actually is helpful in the real world. Another thing is, and we touched upon this a little bit at the beginning, but this whole idea of asking questions. When we ask questions, especially kids, we're trying to deconstruct what's thrown at us. We're trying to make sense of the world. We're trying to be proactive and figure things out for ourselves and find the answers to these things that we're unsure about. It's how we learn. And so society, and again, I include parents and I am a parent now, and I've had a lot of students where, sometimes it's frustrating because they all have these questions all the time. And of course you lose your patience. But if we're able to, instead of damping that down, but actually being like, you know what, I love your questions, keep going. I don't have time right now, or I don't have the answer, but you can figure this out. Here are some resources, get back to me and tell me what you found. But if we kind of instead of teaching kids not to question things, not to question authority, not to the opposite, you need to unlearn that. You should question things. You should be a skeptic. You should not let anything into your head unexamined. You should always seek more explanations until you get closer to the truth. And you should even question yourself and your beliefs, right? Because we all have biases. But this whole notion around questions, I think it's a lesson that we really need to unlearn in order to relearn this skill that's so valuable in the real world. I guess those are three that come up. I know that I talk more in my book, but right now those are the ones that come up.
And those are brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for sharing them with us. And, it makes me think, and also you touch deeper on this, on the learning game. It makes me think that the outliers of our society, really, most of the people that we speak to always say, these typical names, those who dropped out of school, the Zuckerbergs, the Musks, all of these people who decided to take the matters for their own hands and say, I would rather, maybe they didn't do it consciously to say, I want to learn how I stand out. They just realized, maybe the answers, I have them within me, and maybe if I don't, I want to explore why not, and what do those underlying motivations that I have, how can those emerge from within me? And in school, I remember this, maybe a lot of times you pitch an idea to a teacher or to anyone and they just botch it down. I don't have patience for this. This is a bad project. Focus on how you're going to get A on the test. Focus on how you're going to get 100%. And focus on the SATs or whatever, rather than, telling the teacher, hey, I want to explore this. This always goes the wrong way. And, I think it's a good point here, Anna, to ask you about the homeschooling, because, it's a genuine question that I have. And perhaps I just, perhaps the biggest misconception I have here is that maybe socialization and, being friendly with other people maybe goes down with homeschooling. I have no idea. I have also read that, skimmed through that homeschooling actually improves in, intelligence and all of those ideas. So would you care to, share a bit your thoughts on homeschooling with us?
Yeah, I love that you asked that, because that is a very common misconception. And you need to understand that homeschooling has been around for a long time, but it looks very, very different for different people and different families, right? So I always talk about, there's a spectrum when it comes to education. Far on the left, all the way to the left, you have the traditional school system. All the way to the right, you have, homeschooling. Now, in the middle, you have a bunch of different options. More towards the homeschooling side, you have world schooling, which is kind of, a little bit of what I did, but at the same time, not that much because I actually went to physical schools. But then after, my mom would do a lot of world schooling, which is just learning from your environment in all these different countries. You have unschooling, which is kind of like super to the extreme, where parents are like, kids are the directors and constructors of their own knowledge. They can learn or not learn about whatever they want. They can do whatever. So it's like completely unstructured. And I think that, I have my thoughts on that. I think that there's some positive things about it. I think that there is a role for an adult for every kid, and we can talk about that. And then you have like a bunch of other self-directed communities in the middle. You have a mix and match where you send kids to maybe like some forest schools or some places or micro schools for a few days a week, for a few hours. And then kids have the rest of the day to engage in other things. There's online learning. There's a bunch of options. But homeschooling, it depends on how you do it, right? Like some parents actually do traditional schooling, but at home with your parent. And so I'm not that much in favor for that because, and again, that's sort of what comes to mind for a lot of people when they think about homeschooling. And that's why they say, oh, the social aspect, or this is completely undoable. I could not teach my child all the subjects. I'm not an expert. I'm not a teacher. Da, 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 da. So that's not the kind of homeschooling that I advocate for, although it may work for some families, totally fine. But I think that that's where you would, get this notion of, oh, like the social aspect. But really, when you think about like homeschooling done right, kids are learning either from apps or from a parent or from a teacher that comes to your home or in a little environment with other kids for a few hours a day. And then that opens up the rest of the day for them to actually be part of society and enroll in different things and interact with adults and interact with children different ages. So if you think about it, when in the real world do you only interact with people your age? The only place I can think about is school, when you're in grades with only people your age. To me, that's not the real way to socialize. But yet parents don't question that. They question the homeschoolers that are actually socializing in a way that resembles the way that we do it in real life, right? They get their learning out of the way pretty quickly, and then they have the rest of the day to be part of society, right? They're actually socializing the way that we should be socializing. The way that we do it in school doesn't make sense to me. Like only with peers your age in this, room with 24 kids for a whole year. Like what? Like no, right? And so it really depends on how you do it. But what I love about homeschooling is that it's actually really flexible. So you get to, and that's sort of like the hype of it. And a lot of people opt for homeschooling because you get to decide as a parent and as a family how you want to do it, right? And of course, there's some different states and different places that have different restrictions in terms of the things that you need to submit to appear, what is your kid learning about and this and that. But in general, it tends to be very flexible. And so you can decide, like, I don't know if you've read the 4-Hour Workbook of Tim Ferriss, or like this whole idea that, it's not true that we are productively working from 8 to 5, no, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I structure my days in like 3 hours of power work and I get so much done. And then I have the rest of the day to actually do other things, be with my kid and just do whatever it is that I want to do. And so I think it's the same for children. It's not true. And again, I was a teacher in many schools and I was a student of many schools. It's not true that we are learning from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. That's simply BS, right? And there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of wasted time and time that we can give back to kids, right? Time of their childhood that we can gift them back if we're able to actually focus on the academic stuff in shorter span and more effective way, which is, a lot of homeschoolers have been really good at this, so that then they can free up the rest of their time to do other stuff. Now, of course, there are different ways to do this. There are lots of like, oh, but what if, I'm not an expert, I'm not this, I'm not that. I think technology is going to play a bigger role going forward when it comes to this. So at Synthesis, which is the education company that I'm part of, and I know we're not the only ones coming up with this, but it's actually the best one that I've seen so far in terms of resembling a human. But we're coming up with this like one-on-one tutor, this digital tutor, which, by the way, one-on-one tutoring has been known for years that it's the best way to learn. That's, Aristotle's like, taught Alexander the Great one-on-one. Like this is kind of like the examples that we have. But it's just not physically doable. But if you use technology and you leverage technology and you're able to, because the human element is super important when it comes to teaching and learning. Kids need to know that there's a caring adult on the other side that wants you to learn in order to engage in the process. So we've been able to really add that human component to this one-on-one tutor and resembling on real teachers in the real world. to teach you the academic subjects in a really effective way, in a way that is engaging and in a short span, so that you cover that and you actually perform really well on those subjects, so that if you want to go to college later, or you want to take the SAT, or you can do that and you'll excel. And then that frees up the rest of your day for you to do whatever it is that you want. So I think that a lot of homeschoolers and micro schools and a lot of the alternative education space is going to adopt this kind of technology to cover those hard academics that parents claim that they're not experts on, and that, of course, everyone has to be exposed to. And we actually see opportunities for them to for these tutors and for this technology to be part of classrooms as well. I'm not as focused on that because I'm a big believer that you can't really reform or transform the system. I think you really have to start something new because of a lot of the bureaucracies and a lot of the things that are holding this, institution back. But for those that are interested in improving the actual system, a lot of these technologies, I think, will also make a difference. So that's sort of like where we're heading. Hopefully, I kind of answered your homeschooling question.
100%. It was a great answer. And, I'm going to ask you one more question before I get into, synthesis. Where does that lie in the line between, homeschooling extremes, where is synthesis on in terms of education? And also, we're going to wrap up with, a question on your advice to adults, to parents, on where should they choose to put their kids into school, and a few other more questions. But right now you touch on technology. And that was also another misconception that I had before reading your book, is that, I've always thought about video games as an inducer of ADD. And I would always think, I'm playing Call of Duty, I'm going to get mad with people. I'm going to go to Publix and I'm going to be mad. Let's just put it that way. It doesn't happen. I'm a good kid. So it doesn't happen, but it could induce it. That's the point. And if I'm going to play MLB The Show every time, I'm a huge baseball fan, I'm going to be distracted, and I'm going to, and our parents always tells us, don't be in games all the time. But you argue a different point, which is very counterintuitive and extremely insightful, which is we can leverage video games. We can ask, why are they so engaging for our kids? And we can apply them for education. So can you please expand on this idea on how can we leverage video games to other education systems?
For sure. And I want to start by preface that I wasn't a gamer growing up. Of course, I played Nintendo and I enjoyed it, and Super Mario and this and that, but I wasn't a gamer. I was, I had so many other things that I was doing in them that I just wasn't drawn to that as much. But I also want to say that I'm not incentivizing, every kid should be spending all their day playing video games. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I am curious about everything. And so naturally, I became curious about video games when I noticed that they were teaching kids certain skills that are really important for the real world, and that as a teacher, I realized that we were not teaching in school. So I was like, what is it about video games that, for example, get kids to keep going even when they fail? We've talked about this and how important it is to teach kids this skill. And we're not doing a good job in school. We're doing the opposite. And so suddenly when they play video games, they're like, I failed. It doesn't matter. Let me try again. And let me try again. And let me try again. And they can try 100 times. They don't get discouraged until they achieve the next level. And there's a power to that. So that's sort of the first thing that drew me to that. Then when I started studying video games and sort of going into the research, and I had the same concerns that you did. And in my book, I'm sure you read, I cite all the research to kind of give this information to parents, and they can do whatever they want with this. But a few things came up. First, there's a lot we can learn from game designers because they design very compelling learning experiences. Because if you think about what's going on in video games, they are constantly learning new skills. Some of them are transferable to the real world, some of them are not. And those that are transferable, by the way, there has to be a process. It doesn't naturally, it's not like you play a game and then you naturally know what to do in the real world. No, there's a whole reflection component that has to happen that usually an adult is really good at getting involved here, so that kids are able to translate all the good things that they're learning in video games to the real world. And I talk about how and give strategies in the book of what parents can do for that. But what I learned is the thing that I find the most fascinating is that video games are sort of like the ultimate learning machine, because they teach you that you can teach yourself anything, right? And so kids are picking up on these skills, not because a teacher is telling me, no, just because by trying and figuring things out and this and that until they realize and learn all these different skills. And so it also gives them this feeling of competence of, wow, I'm able to achieve these things on my own, that a lot of kids are not feeling in school. Because in school, the way curriculums are set up and the one size fits all lesson plans and this and that, a lot of kids never experience competence, which is a basic human need. And so there's a little bit of that too. But I think that, you know, when you look at the research behind it, you were talking about Call of Duty and, you know, the shooter games and this and that. This is a decision that you need to make as a family if you're going to allow your kids to play, you know, quote unquote, violent games or not, right? But if you actually, and, you know, that's a very personal decision, but if you actually look at the data, it shows that if you're playing violent games, that does not mean that you're going to be doing violent things in the real world. However, if you're playing violent games with strangers online that are anonymous, that you cannot put a face to, then that, and you're doing it all the time, like that, sort of like those kind of games make up the majority of your gaming time, then that can result in a problem. So what the data suggests is that if you are going to be engaging in shooter games or like violent games, that it should not consume most of the time that you're playing games online, and it should be with people that you know, family, friends, and so people that you can put a face to, so that, you know, you don't have those like negative consequences after it. So that's one thing. That doesn't mean, for example, when my kids want to play video games, I'm going to incentivize them not to play those aggressive games, just because it doesn't really make sense for me as a family, not because of this concern that's going to make them more violent, just because, you know, as a family, for me and my values, like I just don't think it's as productive as other games that I've seen. But again, no judgment for those that want to engage in those games. And so that's just, you know, part of it. Then also there's a lot of research that shows the amount of time that is okay for kids to play so that it doesn't become an addiction and an obsession. And, you know, I talk about how it's 21 hours a week. I'm not saying that you should go and tell your kid to play 21 hours a week, but up to 21 hours, you don't see negative consequences. And so if your kid is a gamer and it's really interested in gaming and this is their thing, you know, instead of seeing, you know, trying to suppress that and looking at all the negative sides of it and this and that and talking about the addiction component, I have a whole chapter in the book about the psychology behind screens that talks about, well, what is it that they're so drawn to? And you as a parent figuring that out is really helpful in order to help your kid, you know, find these experiences in the real world as well. And so there's a lot to unpack here. I love this, you know, there are a lot of strategies like this concept of flow, where you actually get kids to, or adults or whoever's playing, to be in this like state where everything kind of stops, everything shuts down, and you're able to really concentrate in this one thing and practice that craft a lot until you get really good at it. That I think that if we're able to bring to the real world and to learning experiences that state, and we're able to replicate that, it would be game changing in education. So I talk about different ways that we can do that and the principles of game design that we can bring to learning experiences to draw kids to learn better and learn more and want to engage. I also talk about gamification versus pointsification, because there's a big distinction there. A lot of people in the education world try to gamify learning to get kids excited. The problem with that is that you're grabbing the elements of games that are actually the least attractive for your intrinsic motivation, and making it all about that. So it's not really about the learning. And what happens is that when the learning gets hard, it's going to get to a point where it's hard. Those extrinsic motivators fade, and then the characters and the points and all the gamification, which is really pointsification, is not strong enough to get kids to want to continue to learn. So it kind of defeats this idea of helping them become lifelong learners. So I talk about all that and then talk about what we can do to grab the best elements of game to bring to the learning process. And so there's a lot here that, again, has opened my eyes to what can we learn. That's sort of the frame that I grab with everything. When people are like, what's good? What's bad? What do you recommend? I'm like, I feel like you can learn from everything, right? Even from those things that you're like, this is really terrible and, you know, screams and blah, blah. Like, if you're curious, and going back to the first question you asked me, if you're curious enough to dive into these topics with an open mind and trying to leave your misconceptions behind, and just with a, you know, I want to learn more about it, you will find that there are always two sides of it, and you can grab and choose whatever works for your family. But I do believe that making technology the enemy is never the right answer, because technology is part of our world, is here to stay, and kids need a lot of help navigating it. And so we need to be their allies, not, you know, what's that barrier between them and technology, because otherwise they're going to figure it out on their own.
Wow, yeah, that's really, really insightful, and it was one of the most interesting insights from the learning game that I took, and now that listening to you, it's even more interesting. And Anna, you know, right now you touch on technology and how, you know, it's here to stay, and it's going to disrupt everything. And I know that you're working, you touched a bit on synthesis earlier. And, I would like, this is a perfect place to discuss more on what you're doing there and how is DARPA related. That's a very interesting point. And, the future of technology with education. So if you want to share with us synthesis in your work there.
Yeah. So when I left the school system and I started to write about all these ideas and these questions in alternative education, I was speaking to different people in this space that were quote unquote innovating. A lot of what they were doing were products to add on to the school system. And like I told you, I'm very, particular about that. I think that, my work is outside of the system. I think that that's where we have a better chance creating an alternative system. And so I finally bumped into these guys that were working. One of them co-founded Ad Astra with Elon Musk. So the school at the SpaceX campus for Elon's kids and the SpaceX employees' kids, very small, like lab school that was incredible. Like a lot of people around the world would visit just to see what they were doing because they were doing things in a very unconventional way. It was a problem-based school. There were no grade levels. It was very game-focused because you don't need to force kids to play games, as we talked about in a bit, right? And so it was a school that did not have all this like bureaucracies and parameters, so they could really had this free reign to let kids learn naturally in the way that they're meant to learn. And so the best course there was this class called Synthesis that Josh Dawn, our co-founder, created. And it was basically all the simulations and problems that kids had to be in teams and compete against each other to solve real problems. And then as they encountered different things, they would meet the tools and their subjects and this and that. So they would do their research and they would learn about the content that they could then apply to solve these problems. It was very fast paced. It was very challenging, but the counterintuitive insights that we base all of our products as Synthesis and that they did at Ad Astra is that kids want to learn and they want to challenge. They want things that are not easy. And by the way, this is something that game designers get really well. You never see game designers designing a game that's easy. They know that that's not going to sell. They need something that's challenging and that's going to take several tries to get it, because that's what engages you. We get it wrong in school. In school, we're trying to water things down or give them like irrelevant textbook problems that are hard that we're like, what? Like, no. Yeah. And so based on this insight, Synthesis became really popular. The students were super engaged in it. The kinds of conversations that they were having were so high level that they looked like executives when they were talking. Like, it was mind blowing. And so they could really bring themselves into the problems and they would fail constantly, and they were learning what to do when that happened. They were not judged by it. It was very fast paced. So they really learned like how to work in teams, because what are the things that we know about the future our kids will inherit? We know that they're going to have to work with other people, right? And so in different roles. And I don't mean like in school teamwork, it's not teaching them how to work with other people. Like that's sort of the and we can talk about that later. But I mean, like, really, how do you work with diverse groups of people in different scenarios? How do you solve complex problems? And how do you face adversity? These are kind of, and then how do you do that when there's not an adult telling you what to do and when there are no instructions? And so we focused on doing this at, Synthesis through the simulations that we were doing. So what happened was that we grabbed this class and we put it online so that kids all over the world could have access to this. So we were teaching the soft skills that kids are not learning in school: how to make decisions under pressure, how to engage in conjecture and criticism, how to pivot when things go wrong, how to fail constructively, how to communicate effectively, like all the skills that we're not teaching in school. And then this year, we actually launched our second product, which is this AI tutor that I spoke about briefly at the beginning. But basically what we did is we paired up with these DARPA researchers that back in 2009 discovered this technology. They were trying to train marine, like IT students, to learn all this content that experts would, learn in the field in 10 years. And they were able to learn it in 16 weeks using the tutor. So it was like groundbreaking technology by DARPA. And the results were so outstanding that we paired up with them and we said, we need to grab this so that we can teach kids all over the world every subject, starting with STEM, right? Which is sort of like the fundamental ones. And so we started with math. And what we did was we grabbed the best math teacher we've seen out there. His name's Dr. Tanton. He's sort of like the curriculum architect for math. And Dr. Tanton, he has a PhD from Princeton in math. He is the ambassador of the United States Math Association. He has written 26 textbooks in mathematics. So he is a content expert. But in addition to that, he's an expert in the art of teaching. He's really, really good at working with kids. He has this passion that's very important in order to transmit this. And so we've recorded him for hours and hours and hours and hours, to the point where we catch his examples, his mannerisms, the way he gives feedback, the way he gives you encouragement, the way he explains concepts, like everything. And we've put it in this tutor that really feels like you're talking to Dr. Tanton. And so it gives you, there's like a workspace where it gives you opportunities to try concepts out before it helps you get to the right answer. It kind of, when you don't understand something, it kind of goes into like all the possible things that could be going on in your brain, and then helps you find the answer for yourself. And what we've noticed is that that's what's motivating kids to keep going and to want to use this program, that they're finally understanding math. And it's not like we have characters and points and all this pointsification that we were talking about that a lot of like the apps that we use in schools have. No, it's actually about the learning. And so it's very early, but the results have been very promising. Kids are advancing. They're learning. By the way, anyone who wants to try out, there's a free demo online that teaches you binary numbers, which, by the way, sometimes you don't learn up to college. It's like, the whole process behind computers. And I was like, I'm never going to learn this because I didn't consider myself good in math. And then I did the lesson with the tutor and I was like, wow, like this is incredible. And so again, there's a lot we still have to do, but the idea is that kids from all over the world, it can be homeschooled kids, it could be kids that are in alternative programs, kids that actually go to school, will be able to use this tutor that's infinitely patient, that will stay with you until you've grasped the topic, that if you already know it, it will help you like advance to the next thing in an adaptive way, and in a way that you really feel like you're interacting with a human, so that you can get this hardcore academics out of the way the most effective way, get really good at them, and then have the rest of the day to do whatever it is that you want. So it's very promising. It's at the early stages, but we have a lot of, desire from families that see the value of something like this. And I'm very optimistic.
Wow, me too. And after listening to you, I'm more optimistic than on the future of education. And I'm hoping that, it really does impact our kids' learning, because at the end of the day, they're going to be our next generation leaders. And why not try to make them the best they can to reach their potential? And as we begin to wrap up, I have two questions. And my first question would be, what advice do you have for parents who are looking to enroll their kids into a school?
Yeah. So this is a hard question to answer, but I guess it's the same idea that I'm trying to convey in my book, which is, don't take, how am I going to say it? Okay, so don't delegate your kids' education completely to school. Don't think naively that school is taking care of everything and that the learning that's happening in school is, what's right, and that it's taking care. No, like parents need, and there's a whole chapter about this in the book, skin in the game. You need to get involved. And I'm not saying that you need to sit down and teach your kid every subject. No, I'm just saying you need to get involved by asking questions, by digging deeper, by trying to determine if your kid is actually learning, is excited, if there are better opportunities for your kid outside of school. If the school is working for your kid, wonderful. And by working, I mean not the good grades. Like, don't pay so much attention to that, but like really engage with your kid and see if they're excited to learn, if these things are sticking, et cetera, et cetera. If not, it is your responsibility to find alternatives. So that's one thing when it comes to like actual school. But then remind yourself that the best and most important teacher that a kid will always have is their parents. And so figure out the things that they're not learning in school. And it is your job to find a way to teach them outside. And it can be through conversations. It could be something that you do during your family dinners. It could be the things that you give importance to as a parent. And then be the perfect enabler. I always say this to parents. The common factor that the most successful people out there have is that their parents supported their crazy obsessions, the things that they were super passionate about, and always had confidence and made them believe that they could achieve whatever they wanted, as long as they were able to work hard on it and put a lot of hours into it. And so I think that if you do that as a parent, even if you can't pull your kid out of traditional school, but you're aware of the possible things that could be going on and you question them, and then you give importance to the things that actually matter, and then you try to find alternatives outside of school to complement the things that they're not receiving, I think that's a great starting point.
Thank you. That's a great advice. And also I'm going to take it for me when in the future, when I have kids. And, my last question, Anna, is regarding your moonshot vision. I read Piero Diamandis. He's a futurist and also he's in the tech world. He's amazing. I want him as a guest here, hopefully soon. But he mentioned an idea that says we should all strive for moonshot visions. We need moonshot ideas. So my question for you is, what is your moonshot vision of our educational system for the future, and how will we get there? How can I help you get there?
Oh, that's awesome. So I think that I envision a world where education's kind of like a menu, where people get to pick and choose what works for them, but there are enough alternatives in that menu that you can find something that's actually doable for your family. Because I am very aware of the fact that parents have to work and that sometimes they don't know who to leave their kids with. So a lot of these things that I propose right now are not feasible for a lot of families. But the more people start, continue to work on alternatives in the education space, and it's never, I don't think it's a competition. I think we all need each other in this world in order to sort of take down the education system. The more, alternatives are going to be out there so that parents can actually decide what's best for their family, for their needs, for their kids, and it can be different from one kid to the other. So hopefully that, diversity of approaches, variety of options, and to empower kids, not the state, with the resources and everything that they need to make it happen. So hopefully a lot of these alternatives that right now are maybe too high cost, and people only have access with technology and this and that, we can make it more mainstream with time as we continue to build the products. And yeah, so hopefully empower families to take charge of the education of their children. I think that would make a better future.
100%. And for everyone listening here, a part of that better future involves all of us reading the learning game, which you can have right now, pre-order or order now with the link in the bio. As I said to Anna, as I was saying to you who's listening to this podcast, this is more than an educational book. It's a book of life and how to really approach life in a different lens, not a conditioned one, but one that comes from our sincerity, and to help our kids get to that sincerity, to that curiosity. So, Anna, thank you so much for joining me. It was really a pleasure having you here.
Thank you, Alex. You asked wonderful questions.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.